In the whole frantic human scene, there is one place where time has a different meaning, where people talk about their country not in terms of decades or centuries, but in thousands of years. That place is Egypt.
Something that my grandmother taught me. I owe everything to her. She taught me that the only eternal thing is land, because it was here thousands of years since the start of Earth, and it will continue to be here until the end of the world.
In this land of Anwar el-Sadat, the past begins earlier and lasts longer than anywhere else. When Moses was alive, these pyramids already were 1,000 years old. Egypt was a superpower then, ruled by pharaohs. When Greece and Rome were in their heyday, these landmarks were world famous. Egypt then was a conquered province. Ever since then, from the downfall of the pharaohs until our own time, the ancient civilization of Egypt has been an example the world keeps turning to, an example of how empires fall and how mankind survives. With the leader and spokesman of modern Egypt, we traveled along the Nile looking for answers to the questions that are bound to strike you in this extraordinary country. What kind of society did it take to produce that remarkable civilization? Why did it happen here in this isolated river valley? Where did it all go? And once it's gone, is there any way to bring back the glory of the past? If you visit Egypt as a tourist, you follow a beaten track, the same route visitors have been following for centuries. Like everything in Egypt, it follows the course of the Nile from Giza, near the modern capital of Cairo, to the ancient capital at Luxor, and then south to Aswan. This was the route we covered. It led us to some of the most spectacular art and buildings to be found anywhere in the world, like this ancient temple at Edfu, preserved by a climate in which rain is a rare event, to art treasures that celebrate life itself. It led us to places that are part of folklore and romance, like the very tomb in which the mummy of Tutankhamun, King Tut, was discovered and still lies buried. What you see here is part of your own heritage, the record left by civilized man in one of his earliest appearances on Earth. Egypt is where people developed a social order and a government, while most of mankind was still roaming the earth in tribes. Here began the history of architecture. Here people learned to measure time by a calendar, to plot the stars by astronomy, and chart the earth by geometry. And here they developed that most awesome of all ideas, the idea of eternity, of time without end and life after death. 5,000 years later, the mind of man is still struggling with those ideas, is still fascinated by the civilization that produced them. That was the Egypt of the pharaohs, the kings who left their mark in colossal works like these, the cluster of pyramids at Giza, the main one built by a pharaoh called Cheops. Of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, only these remain. The river Nile, the Greek historian Herodotus wrote, Egypt is the gift of the Nile. Much of the ancient civilization can be explained by this unique resource. Everywhere else in the world, floods are unpredictable, but here on the Nile, the floods were regular, and though sometimes damaging, they also were a blessing. Late each August, they came surging up from the heart of Africa through the 1,000-mile length of the Nile Valley. For the next 3 months, only hills and temples stood above water. By November, the waters would recede, leaving the fields covered with new layers of rich silt for planting. In the spring, they harvested. Then drought, and they would again await the august miracle of the flood to replenish their parched land. The land was owned by the king, the nobility, and the temples. The farmers worked it as tenants. During the flood season, when the fields were idle, they served as the pharaoh's labor force, building the pyramids and temples. It also is the kind of life that Sadat knows from his own peasant childhood on the same tenant farm that he now owns.
Since I was 3 years old, I walked on this same road, and this same canal was here. 57 years now, and it will continue until eternity, I think.
When you walk these fields today, you see life much as it was in ancient Egypt. Many of the same traditions, the same methods, even the same devices.
I used to sit here as one of those two men, and in early at dawn, because we started early. You know, this is called tambour. There is some screw in it, and it brings the water from the canal to the land here. Small canals. It is prepared only for the small canals.
How many hours would you sit there on that screw?
Every shift is 2 hours. And we use not only to irrigate our land, but the work here, since the start, is collective. We don't have tambour for every farmer here. We have 6 or 7 only in the village. So we make a timetable, and then we start irrigating collectively all our land.
So really it was the fertility of the Nile, the need to utilize the Nile by irrigation that created this first form of government in the world here in Egypt.
Exactly. It is exactly like Herodot said. Egypt is the gift of the Nile.
Even with those ancient irrigation methods, the Nile produced a bounty. Grain and flax and papyrus, the paper of the ancient world. This was the wealth of the pharaohs, the goods they traded for Lebanon's timber, Africa's ivory and gold. The Egyptians divided the Nile's annual cycle, flood, harvest, drought, into 12 months, establishing the first calendar. So the Nile gave man his sense of time.
Much more than this, the Nile has given my people also the sense of eternity, that the human is immortal, that there is a second life. And as I told you, when Nile gave the country prosperity, must have given them this fine touch of art to build for the second life, because they consider that the body may perish, but the soul will continue to live.
The ancient Egyptians believed that though the body perished, it would somehow be reunited with the soul, so it had to be preserved. That was done in a sarcophagus and in coffins within that coffin. They were decorated with portraits of the deceased. This film from the early 1920s documents the unwrapping of a mummy by an Egyptologist named Herbert Winlock, then on the staff of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Beneath layers of fine linen wrapping lies a corpse that ancient embalmers had dried by covering it with a mineral called natron, which absorbed the body's moisture. Spices and herbs also were included in the wrappings. Magical spells were written on a papyrus scroll placed between the thighs. That document called the Book of the Dead. The ancient Egyptians thought that the heart, not the brain, was the center of reason and knowledge. Accordingly, a sacred scarab, symbol of immortality, was placed on the breast, surmounted by the winged symbol of Horus, the god identified with the pharaoh. Finally, stripped of the wrappings which gave it lifelike dimensions, we see the body still intact for its reunion with the soul in the second life. As to where that second life would be lived, well, the Egyptians had no notion of a heaven, a Valhalla, or paradise. The Nile Valley, this blessed garden in the midst of a desert, was as close to paradise as they could imagine. It was here, they believed, that the souls would live forever in the company of their gods. And it was to provide a safe, eternal home for the dead that the Egyptians created architecture. This building is a landmark of Western civilization. It marks the entrance to the royal tomb complex of King Zoser at Saqqara, the first stone buildings in history. Before Saqqara, 2600 BC, houses, palaces, and even royal tombs were built of sun-dried brick, all of which crumbled away in antiquity. But Saqqara was conceived to last for eternity, so it was built of limestone. When they cut the stone, they simply imitated nature. A bundle of reeds became the first architectural column. Overhead, the stone cutters produced roofing suggesting logs. Even the hinges of the main door were carved in stone, the door standing open. The Egyptians believed that their priests would guard this sacred place forever. It didn't quite work out that way. The burial chambers of King Zoser, cut from the bedrock deep beneath the desert, are still there, though you can see them only by special permission. They were rediscovered by archaeologists in the 1920s. Down here with the king, his subjects buried the worldly goods and treasures he would need in the afterlife. But the treasures have disappeared, probably stolen by tomb robbers in ancient times. So was King Zoser's body. All you find at the bottom, all the archaeologists found, is an image of the pharaoh on the wall of an empty tomb. We know who planned Saqqara, Imhotep. Certainly an original genius, he's the first architect known to the world. To mark the pharaoh's tomb, he developed the very symbol of Egypt, the pyramid, in an early step-like form. The great age of pyramid building lasted about 2 centuries, the early period of Egyptian art and architecture. During that time, the architects gradually perfected the pyramid's ultimate form, an ideal one for this broad landscape. All these structures are perfectly square, the 4 sides perfectly aligned with true north, east, south, and west. That's how well the Egyptians had mastered astronomy and engineering over 4,000 years ago. Today, about 80 pyramids are still standing, some barely standing. Not one of them provided the safekeeping their builders sought, not even the Great Pyramid of Cheops with its obstacles and tricky passageways. When tomb robbers forced their way in during the Middle Ages, they found the burial chamber empty, except for the granite sarcophagus of King Cheops, and even that was empty. It wasn't until 1952 that one treasure of Cheops was found, preserved in an airtight pit alongside his pyramid. This was the royal boat. It's a masterpiece of shipbuilding, over 140 feet long. Its 1,200 pieces of cedar wood had been carefully stored away for the pharaoh's ultimate journey.
This was part of the tradition at that time that the soul will take this ship and sail after the body perishes to the second world with all the commodities that he needs in the second world.
Long after Cheops, long after they stopped building pyramids, the Egyptians retained their strong feelings about the importance of the tomb.
My grandmother taught me, Walter, the man will only be a man when he builds his house and his tomb. You see, the philosophy behind this is that you shall be independent. You have your own house, you have your tomb, so you are independent. Whatever comes, well, you are going to face it. If you live, it is okay, you are in your house. If you die, they will find a tomb for you. They will not ask anyone to take you and bury you there also. So these are the philosophy of the old traditions in Egypt here. This is a new tomb that I built for myself, but I'm not going to be buried here. I'm putting in my will that I ask it to be buried there on Mount Sinai, in the mosque that will be built in the site of the three temples. Just a plain one, a plain grave, I told them.
No pyramid.
No pyramid at all, no.
Well, it would continue the continuity of the pharaohs.
The ancient Egyptians believed that the sun was born each day, and after its journey across the heavens, would die as it sank below the horizon. For over 1,000 years, starting about 1500 BC, the sun shone on this place as on no other place on earth. This is Luxor, Thebes to the Greeks of the classical age. They came here the way people in our own century go to Paris or New York, to see the wonders of the world's greatest city. This was the capital of the pharaohs when their empire was at its zenith. And here they presided over the religion that united and inspired their society. This temple was dedicated to the worship of Amun, the most revered of their many gods. He was represented by the ram. Pharaoh after pharaoh vied with their predecessors to leave a lasting mark on these sacred precincts. The temple grew to become the largest religious complex ever built, the Temple of Karnak. Reliefs on the walls of the inner shrine portray the rites practiced here: processions, animal sacrifices, festivals. The glory of Karnak is a great hall, a forest of columns, each rising almost 70 feet. Only the pharaoh, the living god, and the priests were allowed to enter here. Karnak has been called an encyclopedia of Egyptian history carved in stone. The pharaohs spent 2,000 years building this vast place, and then for another 2,000 years, Karnak was abandoned. To this day, acres of the temple grounds remain covered over with the crumbled brick of centuries, and there's no telling what works may still lie buried here. But for the last 150 years, Egyptologists have been systematically digging out Karnak's secrets. These French archaeologists are cataloging blocks from the time of Pharaoh Akhenaten that were reused in the foundation of a later pylon. Another modern discovery found in pieces, the shrine of the pharaoh Sesostris. It was reconstructed in 1938. The masterworks of one era had simply been recycled in another throughout ancient times. These granite blocks depicting Queen Hatshepsut are waiting to be reassembled, waiting for funds. The best-known treasure from Queen Hatshepsut's reign is her funeral temple directly across the Nile from Karnak. There, even while tourists roam freely through most of the site, Egyptian stonecutters are working to restore the building under a team of Polish archaeologists. The Queen's name can be seen on her works, inscribed in an oval frame called a cartouche. So are all royal names. The royal faces are known to us from their many portraits. Hatshepsut herself portrayed as a sphinx. The false beard is another royal symbol. Amenhotep I, his reign launched an era of great prosperity. Tutmosis III extended the empire far into the Middle East. Pharaoh after Pharaoh, they reigned in an age of remarkable stability, ruling the country through a vast government bureaucracy, a military caste, a huge civil service, a powerful priesthood. Pharaoh Akhenaten disrupted the religious establishment by worshiping the sun as the only god. His successor, Tutankhamun, the boy king, restored Amun and the other gods. He died before he was 20. These portraits are not mere likenesses. They are treasures from a golden age of art, sculpture, and architecture. The greatest builder among all the pharaohs was the one called Ramesses the Great, Ramesses II. He ruled for 67 years. Ramesses the Great, remembered in his many monuments. He was probably the pharaoh of the Exodus, though the event is not mentioned in Egyptian history. But it is his political and military record that makes him a figure of special interest to his modern successor, President Sadat. This is one of the many representations Ramesses had carved of his battle against the Hittites at Kadesh in what is now Syria. Surrounded by the enemy, the king battled his way out. Ultimately, Ramesses came to diplomatic terms with the Hittites, and in recording his agreement with his former mortal enemy on this wall at Karnak, he left history's oldest peace treaty.
Beginning with this day, we cause to be made good peace and good brotherhood between us forever, and he is in brotherhood with me and at peace with me. And I am in brotherhood with him and at peace with him forever. And the children of the great chief of the Hittites shall be in brotherhood and at peace with the children of Ramses, the great ruler of Egypt.
Ramesses' interest in peace for his children is understandable. He fathered 200. 111 sons and 59 of his daughters are known to us by name. In the role of king and god, ruler and high priest, the pharaoh represented absolute authority, the powers of church and state combined. Yet the people knew also that their pharaoh was mortal, like themselves a part of nature that would one day die as all things die. Death, in their belief, was associated with the West, where the sun was thought to die each night. It was on the west bank of the Nile, across from Thebes, that the pharaohs fastened their plans for that second life after death. Perhaps the pharaohs could not foresee that the very stones of their temples would have been stolen by later generations. But they were well aware that the tombs of their predecessors had been ransacked by treasure seekers, the very mummies ripped open. Fearful for the future of their souls, they now had their bodies entombed in secret. They chose a forbidding valley just a few miles from the capital, a place that has become synonymous with death and mystery, the Valley of the Kings. Over 60 royal tombs have been uncovered in the cliffsides. Others may still be undiscovered, as the tomb of Tutankhamun was until the 20th century. Though the tombs vary in size and decoration, each one consists of a series of chambers descending into the mountainside. The longer a pharaoh lived, the more years were spent enlarging his tomb. This is where many a visitor has discovered the splendors of ancient Egypt. The sarcophagus of Seti I, father of Ramesses, is seen in this wall painting on his journey into the tomb. The greater journey was the one to the hereafter, past the serpents who were believed to guard the caverns of the afterlife, a journey to be made with the Nile Valley gods by boat. tomb of Seti I is emblazoned with the stars and planets of the pharaoh's cosmos, the mythology of a man who believed himself to be a god. The artists and craftsmen who worked on the tombs lived in a community of their own. From the ruins, it appears to have held about 80 families. They were paid in produce, not money, and there's one recorded instance of a strike when the government missed a payday. Tombs were built for those who could afford them. Eternal life was reserved for the rich and powerful, in this case for a prince, one of the sons of Ramses III. For all of their somber purpose, the tombs of Thebes are joyful places, depicting everyday life at its zestiest. On these walls, we have the most intimate record of life in an ancient society. The work of servants and farmers, cooks and cabinet makers, the red tape of government bureaucrats. Here, a farmer and his wife are visited by a government surveyor named Mena, accompanied by his assistants. The lesser bureaucrats appear smaller because in Egyptian art, rank is often indicated by the size of the figure. The officials are measuring the farmer's harvest with a knotted cord, measuring it for tax purposes. This scene may show the ancient penalty for tax evasion. Punishment is administered on the spot. Here's the life of children who squabbled and played games, of grown-ups who played music, wrote poetry, loved jokes. Scenes like these, scenes of sports, hobbies, and feasts, show how much the Egyptians savored this life even while preparing for the next one.
Some paintings you shall see in Luxor, you may think that they were done just last week, and they lived 5,000 years, while we have to paint our houses now yearly or every 2 years or so.
Mr. President, do you think that all of those old Egyptians believed all of this really? The life after death, the transport by boat to a better life and carrying along their wealth with them. Did they really believe that, do you think? Or were there some infidels among them?
For sure, they must have believed this, but in any community there must be some infidels. But they are not the masses, or all this art and architecture that we have found, and civilization could have never been achieved.
With its current flowing north and the prevailing winds blowing south, the Nile was easy to navigate, even with primitive boats. Easy for government to unify the people living along its banks. The Pharaoh's territory extended 1,000 miles from the Mediterranean south to Aswan. At Aswan, we accompanied President Sadat aboard his launch on a cruise of the river below the high dam. A cruise that took us past ancient Nubian villages up there on the cliffs. The Nubians are one of the two basic peoples who formed the population of ancient Egypt and modern Egypt, the others being the lighter-skinned Egyptians.
You know, when you look at the fertility of the lower Nile Valley and then the harshness of the land here,
Right.
one wonders, how have they survived for these thousands of years?
You may be amazed to know when we heightened the old dam, some of their villages were flooded, but they wouldn't leave their villages except when they found that they will be flooded. The rest, who are not flooded like these, they stayed here. And then one asks, how can they manage to live on such rocks only? Again, it is nature. No one in my country, Egypt, likes the land like the Nubians here.
Do the Nubians, as the people in the lower Nile, do they cling to their ancient customs as well?
For sure. Their dances, their language. They have a complete different language. It is not written, but they use it between themselves. They have their, as I told you, their dances, their language, their traditions, marvelous customs.
Performed today look as if they were choreographed from ancient temple carvings. These young dancers have organized a troupe that performs for visitors in Aswan. We accompany them to a special performance in one of the ancestral villages where they continue to live.
These islands that they live on here, the Elephantine Islands,
Yes.
also provided the granite, the Aswan granite, that
Yes.
the pharaohs quarried and sent down river to build their temples and their tombs.
Right.
Do you still quarry this granite?
Yes, it is one of the most beautiful granite in the world.
Downstream, 150 miles from the Aswan quarries, lies a staggering example of ancient stone-cutting genius, most likely toppled by early Christians. This is the Colossus of Ramesses the Great at Thebes. Modern scientists estimate that the original stone weighed more than 1,000 tons. There was hardly any limit to the scale of their ambitions. This obelisk, abandoned in the quarry, remains one of the tourist spectacles of Aswan. Another abandoned work is this massive sarcophagus. It probably dates from the period of Roman occupation around the time of Christ. A few hundred feet away, local workmen still cut the unyielding, coarse-grained Aswan granite. But they work on a far more modest scale than their ancestors.
The same rocks, the same granite, we still quarry it. But last year, starting from last year, we started a joint venture with the Italians to work on much more new technology.
Do you export the granite?
Yes, in a little quantity, but after this joint venture that I told you about, I think it will be exported on a larger scale.
Speaking of the Nile and its beauties, of course, we're here in this lake formed by the low dam that was built in 1903 and the high dam up above us here that was built beginning in 1960, was 60 something.
Exactly.
Like that. Right. And of course, where we're going to Philae, the temple at Philae is not only a ancient wonder, but in a sense a wonder of the modern world and modern technology, because when the low dam was built 77 years ago now, it began to fill in this lake and covered Philae on its original island.
Right.
And you excavated it and moved the entire thing to an island that you made look just like the other one. We can see it, as a matter of fact,
That's right.
as we get up there. Some of the work's still going. It's not quite completed yet.
Quite right, quite right, quite right.
Wonderful to watch them working, because as they work on the sides of the hills there, you could almost picture in your mind's eye, despite the modern cement mixer, the modern reinforcing rods, you could picture them building that temple originally.
Well, this is the way I like it in my country. Let us keep the roots of the past, but let us use in the same time the most up-to-date technology to make it easier and to make it much more perfect.
To the modern visitor, this building on Philae looks like a traditional Egyptian temple, one of the most beautiful of all. But the pharaohs pictured on these pylons are actually not Egyptians. They are foreign conquerors, Greeks and Romans who represented themselves as pharaohs, ruling through the ancient religious system. After more than 2,000 years of glory, the power of Egypt had faded. The age of Egypt was passing. Philae is where you see the transition. You see this unmistakable signature of a conqueror, the Roman arch. It was here on Philae, sacred to the goddess Isis, that the worship of Egyptian gods lingered on even into Christian times. All the fervent belief of the ancients, the faith that had inspired them since the dawn of history, had shrunk down to this little island, Philae.
The Greek and the Roman period here really marked the beginning of Egypt's intensive contacts with the West. In all of that time, of that intensive contact, who ended up influencing whom the most?
Well, it is a tradition we are very proud of. Egypt always absorbs whoever invaded Egypt, and never Egypt was absorbed by anyone. Really, it is a pride of us. Well, as you see, Egypt survived all those, Greeks and Romans, this fine architecture, this fine civilization, this fine monument shows who survived the other.
Egypt survived, but her ancient culture did not. Stable and conservative, it had become stagnant, and dynamic new ideas were coming in from outside. The ancient gods were abandoned, their images defaced. The ancient language and hieroglyphic writing totally forgotten. Egypt began 2,000 years of foreign domination by Arabs, then Turks, finally French and British. But of all the outside forces, the most powerful, the most lasting, was not a ruler nor an army, but a new religion, the faith of Islam. Brought in by conquerors from Arabia in the 7th century AD, Islam offered the promise of everlasting life in the company of God, offered it even to those who could not afford to have their bodies preserved. It was soon embraced by the majority of Egyptians. The Quran, the holy book of Islam, is modern Egypt's basic law. Though the modern president exercises extraordinary political power, like his ancient predecessors, the pharaohs, he does not serve as the spiritual head of the religious establishment as they did. He speaks about Islam simply as a devout believer.
In Islam, and this is something I think which gives life honor. In Islam, it is stated that only in life we are in a transitional period until we reach the eternity, where will be no human atrocities, no bad deeds, all this in eternity. All of us, we will live forever. And life is considered in Islam a transitional period. For that, it's very essential in Islam that you must act so that you can win the eternity.
The life looks to an outsider from the Western world to be terribly poor, terribly mean. It doesn't look like there's any opportunity for joy. How do they enjoy themselves?
Well, it is like this. Here, from sunrise to sunset, we are in the fields. Well, this is something that I can't describe to you. The beauty of it, from sunrise to sunset in the fields, working, irrigating, playing, and then at sunset we return and have our meal, our main meal. We are not accustomed to stay after 8 o'clock at all. We sleep very early and we wake up very early. For recreation or for amusement or anything like that, it is either someone who is came to the village to recite Quran or so, and we gather around him, or in a wedding. If there is a wedding in the village, we used to go and dance, and we sing the very primitive songs and so.
This temple here at Philae represents the twilight of ancient Egypt, the beginning of the end of its richness and its power. Must all superpowers have a decline like this?
It must be. It must be. It must be a cycle that is continuing. And I think the time has come that Egypt here will provide something to the whole world like it provided the first civilization, in all humbleness. But it will not be in the field of technology, because we can't say that we can give the world any new technology. On the contrary, we want the new technology here, but in the morals, in principles, in nature, in faith, in love of beauty, all this, I think it will start from here again.
Sadat himself has offered a kind of moral example to the world in his risk-taking efforts to bring peace to the Middle East. It's hard to say whether he will succeed and whether Egypt can continue to provide an example in the future. But Egypt's past surely will continue to illuminate the story of the human race, will continue to inspire any who come here seeking hope for its survival.